We are going to talk again this week and then next week about specific prophecies that prophets made about nations in the Old Testament. And of course, we're in the part of the class where we are trying to show that it's reasonable to believe in the Bible to the point where there is enough evidence to show that it had to have come from an outside source, not just written by people. All right? And that's important to our evidences class. Not just the first part that showed scientific things, but the second part showing that the Bible is very different than the other religious books that are around us. And one of the things we mentioned last week was that the Old Testament prophets had two major tasks. The first one was forthtelling. Forthtelling was the primary reason why the Old Testament prophets talked. And that was telling Israel about what God wanted when they were doing things wrong. Straighten up, do this instead. And the secondary purpose of a prophet was foretelling. In other words, telling something that was going to happen in the future, most of the time because of something that someone was doing wrong. If you don't straighten up, this is what is going to happen. Just an example of what we're talking about here is in Jeremiah chapter 28, where Jeremiah kind of summarizes the main criteria of a prophet of God in his foretelling is when the word of the prophet comes to pass, it will be known that the Lord is truly sent the prophet. So, if a prophet says such and such is going to happen and it doesn't. So, given the fact, like we talked about last week with Syria, that some of these things that happened wasn't for a very long time. And in the case of today, we're going to find that some of them don't even happen until more modern times. Then if the prophet, Jeremiah here is saying that the only way you're going to know that the word of a prophet comes from God is if it comes true, he's not just talking to Israel. He's talking to us. Okay? Because some of this happened after Jesus' time. Some of the fulfillments. All right? And if that's true, then he's telling us, look at a prophet, look at somebody like Nostradamus, look at somebody like Gene Dixon, and then look at the Old Testament prophets. Which one did the prophecies come true? All of them. All right? In his book, The Prophet Motive, a guy named Kenny Bearfield talks about this quite a little bit, and he gives quite a few different criteria, several things to assess whether or not a prophecy is actually predictive. And just to take and look at a few here, the prediction should occur well in advance of the fulfillment. It's got to be something that you're not talking about something where you see an accident about to happen and you're predictive by saying, oh, there's going to be an accident. Talking about some of these events that these prophets are talking about didn't happen for 20 years, 100 years, 1,000 years. All right? But they happened. Unfortunately, everybody forgot about that the prophet made those predictions, but God wrote them down so you can look back and you can test them. All right? Predictions should be accurate. They come true, and they come true in a way that actually makes sense, not something where you have a prophet like Nostradamus where you can interpret it about anything, about any time in any generation. Fulfillment should show no evidence of collusion or manipulation. There can't be a rolling of a weighted dice, a flipping of a two-sided coin, or picking out a red marble when there's nothing but red marbles in the bag. Apply this to the things that the prophet is talking about, and there can't be something that says it happened because it was rigged, so to speak. Fulfillment should be obvious. In other words, it can't be something that is maybe he said this and he was right about it. Maybe he said something else. And predictions should be repetitive and consistent. He even makes one, then two, then three, then four. They all come true. And consistently, they come true. Predictions should also suggest some kind of guidance other than people, some kind of supernatural guidance. With that, we're going to begin talking today, our first one, about Tyre. Tyre was a city on the Mediterranean. It is first mentioned in Joshua chapter 19 as part of the inheritance of the tribe of Asher. It was a fortified city. In fact, it is described in verse 29 of chapter 19 of Joshua as being a strong city, which meant it was fortified. And Joshua was actually unable to capture it, and eventually it never was conquered by the Israelites, which was a problem. That happened in several areas of Palestine where they didn't actually take everything they were supposed to. And those places ended up being problems for Israel throughout the rest of the Old Testament. By the time of David, Israel had formed actually a friendly alliance with this city. It was an evil city. Jerusalem, or Israel, was supposed to be God's people, but they had formed alliances with some of these other places and peoples that they never conquered that they were supposed to. And King David and King Solomon actually heavily relied on Tyre's supply of things like timber and skilled labor to build the temple. Tyre was notorious, though, for its wickedness and idolatry. This resulted in numerous warnings and predictions by Israel's prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Joel, Amos, and Zechariah, all foretold of what was going to happen to Tyre and its destruction. In the New Testament, we know that Jesus, for a short time, went up into northern Palestine and spent a little time up towards Tyre. And he actually healed the daughter of a Canaanite woman from that area. But later on, he also mentions Tyre as an example of an unrepentant city in both Matthew and in Luke. One of the most fascinating sets of predictions in the Old Testament are the ones made on the city of Tyre in Ezekiel chapter 26. Tyre was a financial banking city. In other words, it was like Geneva, Switzerland. Lots and lots of nations right now keep their money in Geneva, all right, because it's a safe haven. It's a tiny little country. If anybody ever wanted to take Geneva and just bomb it and take all their gold, it would be easy. But the world would cry out because that's where everybody's got their gold. So nobody touches it. That's the way that Tyre was back at that time. It was also an international city, kind of like New York or Toronto or some of the other big cities that have a multicultural, multi-racial mix of people in it. Tyre was small in size, but it held the world's banks, and it got along with everybody. Politically, it was neutral. So there was never cause of any kind for an international problem with it. And size-wise, was only about a mile and a half, 1.5 square miles in area. It was tiny, okay? It wasn't very big. Geographically, it was actually an absolute perfect place. You'll see the circle is where Tyre was. You can see Tyre in there in little letters. Underlined is Jerusalem. And the lines that go across the Mediterranean Sea there show you all the different places where it had commerce from. Okay? Very important city. Tyre's reach stretched for Greece and Rome and Egypt, North Africa and Spain, among others. We also can see here that Damascus to the north and Edom was to the south, and the Philistines were at the west, and Israel was in the form of Israel and Judah were in the center. So it was in a kind of the exact perfect place to have commerce for all places at that time period. The city had two pieces, okay? And you'll notice up here That's where, this is the traditional area for Palestine, Judah and Israel, etc. But when you focus in just on that small part of that circle of Tyre is, you see two spots. You see a mainland here, and then you see an island about a half a mile away. That was all Tyre, right? That's what Tyre was in ancient times. So, it had two major harbors. The island was close enough where it could get support from the mainland, but sufficiently far away from the mainland to be nearly impossible to capture, as we're going to see in some examples later on. But then again, who would ever consider trying to do that? Because, nobody wanted to do that until Isaiah said in 23:7 something about this old city, and Herodotus, which is a famous Greek historian, talked about how old the city was. It was very, very old. In fact, it probably existed 4,800 years ago from us. Okay, that's a long time. That city was old, very, very old. But like I said, Isaiah goes on to say some other things about Tyre, and that's these. Tyre is destroyed and left without house or harbor. It had two major harbors, and it said it's not going to have any. We're going to see how. The harvest of the Nile was the revenue of Tyre, and she became the marketplace of nations. That's telling us a little bit about who Tyre was, all right? So we wouldn't mistake who it is. When word comes to Egypt, they will be in anguish. So this is going to be the reaction of the world when Tyre falls. Who planned this against Tyre? And this is kind of a rhetorical question because there's a prophet that's telling this. All right? So who's implied that the rhetorical question is about? It's about the God of the Old Testament. It's about the God of the prophet that was giving these predictions. The answer comes in verse 9 where it says, the Lord Almighty planned it to bring down her pride and all her splendor and to humble all who are renowned on earth. Like Egypt, Tyre was known for things like its talented, skilled artisans. They had people that worked with gold and silver and bronze and iron and purple and yarn and engraving. Tyre was also known for its shipbuilding. They built some of the best ships in the ancient world. Plus, its location and rich clientele made it the perfect place to trade goods across the Mediterranean. So it wasn't just a banking city. It had all these artisans that brought in bukus of money, and it was the perfect location for a big trade center, which it did in Old Testament times. But the Old Testament prophets condemned Tyre because it ruthlessly pursued wealth and felt no moral obligation to achieve its riches. It was an evil city. This is its god, main god. It was Melqart, Melqart, who was supposedly the son of the Phoenician god Baal, also known as Beelzebub, which Jesus talks about. All right? Was king of the underworld. The religion of Tyre's people encouraged a low view of human life, so much so, and this is something that happened more than people know across the Old Testament world, the ancient world. It would actually take children away from parents and offer them as sacrifices to this god. Okay? There were other cultures that did the same thing, but Tyre's god was one of them that they offered sacrifices to. Zechariah said about Tyre, has heaped up silver like dust and gold like dirt. In other words, they had so much of it, that's all they cared about. And for centuries, Tyre had used its wealth and neutrality to avoid warfare. Over the centuries, Tyre had aligned itself with nations like Assyria and Egypt. So in other words, it was a tiny country, but it had big brothers. All right? Kind of like the United States nowadays takes some of the smaller countries that aren't a threat to them and has a treaty with them that, look, if somebody actually bombs you, we're going to go after them. So people leave them alone for the most part. They had the same kind of agreement with two other bigger nations. And finally, Tyre became so independent that Assyria, one of the guys that was protecting it, had enough. And they actually attacked Tyre. Now, Tyre had an island stronghold, but it only had 12 ships. Assyria had more people, and it had 60 ships. But Tyre's fleet was superior, and it actually defeated the Assyrians. Okay, this tiny little nation. So it had the ability to hold off strikes if it had to. In fact, among the kings that came to try to take Tyre was Sennacherib. We've already talked about Sennacherib, all right? Sennacherib is the guy that was contemporary with Hezekiah in 2 Kings chapter 18. So these are all connected. These are real people. These aren't things that are just being made up by somebody that wrote these prophecies sometime well after they happened. It was in this context that Ezekiel chapter 26 makes these particular predictions. Nebuchadnezzar would destroy Tyre. Now, think about this. It's not saying something like what Nostradamus said, some nation will come and destroy some other nation. It says Nebuchadnezzar, who was a king at that time, is going to destroy Tyre. It's specific, just like it's supposed to be. Many other nations will gang up on Tyre, which would seem impossible because, like we said, it was like Switzerland. It wasn't a major power. Nobody wanted to fight it at the time the prophecy was made. Tyre will become flat like a rock, a bare rock, and fishermen will spread their nets across it. Now, we're talking about an extremely sophisticated city. It's like saying that New York City is going to become a fishing town. It ain't going to happen. All right? But we're going to see something happens that we don't imagine. And finally, the city will be thrown into the water. Now, this is important because, remember we talked about tells? Those big mounds of dirt, all right? And then they dig down in those mounds of dirt and they see there's this civilization, and underneath that they dig a little farther and they find another one, and dig down and they find another one. These are all over the Middle East, all right? The reason why that they find all this is because if there was a city there and it was conquered, then time would go by, some of it would be filled in, and the next people that came there would take those old pieces of building material and build a new city on top of that mountain. And the next group would do the same. And the next group would do the same. And then after there was several layers there, the last city wouldn't be rebuilt again, and now there's this big mountain. So saying that the city would be thrown into the water and that Tyre would never be rebuilt is kind of goes against the culture at the time. Why would somebody take the building materials from a good city, even if it was conquered, and throw it away and never rebuild it? That seemed impossible also. But we're going to see that these predictive judgments came actually against Tyre. Now, and they were accurate. First one we're going to talk about is the first one on the list. 3 years after this prediction, Nebuchadnezzar laid siege on the city of Tyre. And the reason was that Tyre was becoming too independent. The standoff lasted 13 years. Tyre finally told Nebuchadnezzar after 13 years, okay, you back off and we'll get ready and we'll come out and you can come in and we'll be okay. So Nebuchadnezzar took them at their word, figured they'd beat them. He waited. Nobody ever came out. So he came back, he got inside the city, and they were all gone. Guess where they went? They went to the island. But unfortunately, Nebuchadnezzar didn't have an army, or didn't have a navy, and he hated boats. But he got really mad and he tore down part of the city, he burned part of the city. Everybody else was a half mile away. Ezekiel's first prediction came true. Wait another 300 years. Now we're up to the time of Alexander the Great. You probably heard of him in history. You ever heard of Alexander? Oh, good. Okay. As he did go around conquering all these different nations, he demanded that the cities that he approached have their doors open so he could just walk right in. And most cities knew that he was like, had a big army, and the Greeks were taking over, so they did that. Not Tyre. Okay, Tyre didn't do that. In fact, Tyre went all the way out to the island. They already had a big city out there because of Nebuchadnezzar's time, but everybody in the mainland, so everybody was out to that island. Like I said, that was Alexander fought his wars between 336 and 323. Alexander the Great, it's fascinating to study the history of his conquering. He died at a very early age. It was like 30 something. And it was because he drank so much, knowing that he was winning all these wars, and he was young. And eventually his kingdom ended up being split between several of his generals, and that's a whole story in itself. But this particular battle I'm going to talk about is extremely well documented in ancient times. People know about this particular battle. When he got there, the population was on the island. This is a sketch of what it probably would have looked like at the time. Notice that he's got a big navy. In fact, by this time, Alexander the Great, as he was conquering, had acquired about 250 ships. He had a big navy. Tyre had about 80 by that time. So they were outgunned. But how do you get a ship up close enough when the walls of the city come right down to the water and there's no place to stand? All right? There was no place for his army to stand, and all he had to do was bombard the ships and sink them as they came up. Alexander the Great was a kind of a guy that said, there's always going to be a way. And he figured one out. It was a master of engineering and a stroke of genius. What he did was he took and demolished the entire old city on the mainland, took all the timbers, took all the rocks, took all the big blocks. Guess what he did with them? He threw them in the water, fulfilling another prophecy. Okay? This is an artist's depiction, but this is probably what it was looking like at the time it was happening. It stretched a half a mile from the mainland. These are a couple of things they have so they can catapult things in, and they built little by little by little by little a causeway all the way out to that island. Okay, so this is prophesied in the Old Testament, but nobody really makes that association. They know about the battle. It's a historic marvel. It's something that everybody reports on, but they don't give the prophets in God the credit for it happening, even though it was predicted by them hundreds of years before. This took the army about 7 months to complete. All right? This is the mainland. This is the island where they were at, and the black line around it is their fortress. And that line right there, white line with the blue on it, is the half a mile that Alexander the Great made to get to that city and eventually conquer that city. Alexander was not only victorious, he killed 8,000 people that were Tyre citizens and enslaved 30,000 more. Alexander the Great only lost 400 men. This was a huge, huge victory. With this event, other parts of Ezekiel's prophecy against Tyre came to pass. One was the city was thrown into the sea. All right? Now we know why this bill of materials weren't reused. Because God predicted it. Alexander the Great got mad, figured out a way to get to him so he could conquer him. But, did this happen as a stroke of genius from Alexander the Great, or was this in a direct correlation to the predictions made by God? You have to decide. And as a result, Tyre became flat as a rock, bare rock, because there was no tell that could be built up there because all the building materials were thrown into the Mediterranean, into the harbors. Now, what did that do to its harbors? With that going across, there is no harbor. All right? And you're going to see it even gets worse over time in another couple of slides here. This is part of one of the old temple areas that's still standing on Tyre. All right? And this, you can see, the new city is a little bit modern. It's not huge. The area isn't that big. But you can see the old with the new. But this is more of what it looks like today. You can see that causeway originally in the brown that's going across, but over the centuries, the shoreline actually extends here, and that's all filled in now. So you can't actually physically see. I mean, they can tell by digging down and stuff where it's at, but you can't actually just see it because it's all kind of covered over. And this is what the area looks like today. That's an aerial view actually of where Tyre is. It's just a small village. Okay? Over the years, a lot of different nations, Tyre tried to build itself up, but a lot of different nations had other ideas. The Persians, the Greeks, the Seleucids, the Armenians, and the Romans. Every time Tyre tried to build itself up, they tore Tyre back down. It would seem that since Tyre was in the perfect location to be an international banking and trading center, that somehow it would have survived. That even if that wasn't the people from Tyre that did it, but other people instead would maybe go to that area and do the same thing that Tyre did. But it never happened. Tyre even had an extremely good water supply, millions of gallons of fresh water, which made it a city that people would have wanted. But none of that made it able for Tyre to actually rebuild itself to become the city that it once was. Over the millennium, ancient Tyre was torn down every time that someone tried to rebuild it. In more modern times, the Muslims tore it down in 500 to 600 AD. The Crusaders, when they marched through, tore it down about 1100 AD. Okay, so this is not something that this was over 15, 16, 1700 year period of time that all this happened. Ezekiel said this: "They shall destroy the walls of Tyre and break down her towers, and I will scrape her soil from her and make her a bare rock. She will be in the midst of the sea," okay, thrown in the sea, "a place for spreading nets." It was an international banking center, okay? It had artisans. It wasn't a fishing town, and it said that Tyre absolutely hated fishermen. But this is what happens in Tyre now. That's a picture of a place where the boats come, they fish, they come back, and they spread their nets to dry, just like the Old Testament prophets said. An early Christian writer put it this way, and I don't know the source for sure, but this is I found this quote: "Instead of an ancient commerce that was so active and extensive, Tyre is reduced to a miserable village that has no more trade than a few sacks of corn. The whole village is contained only contains about 50 or 64 families who live on the produce that they get from their own ground and a little bit of fishery." In other words, Tyre never became anything but a poor city. Now, it looks a little modern nowadays. This was from probably a few centuries ago, but still, it's not a very big city. Ezekiel said this, because Tyre has said of Jerusalem, aha, the gate of the nations is broken and its doors have swung open to me. Now that she lies in ruins, I will prosper. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I am against Tyre, I am against you, Tyre, and I will bring many nations against you. Case closed. Exactly what happened to Tyre. Whoa. Okay. Clock. I'm going, hey, I got another 45 minutes. Any questions on Tyre? We're going to cover one more today. Then we're going to cover at least one next week. Right? We're going to cover Egypt next. Egyptologists have known for a long time that ancient Egypt was an empire dating back at least 3000 BC. It was an old nation. It's possibly the greatest empire ever. I mean, we've seen some of these kinds of things that it produced, and to our modern knowledge, we don't even know how to do some of this nowadays. They were marvelous in what they knew how to do. They had craftsmen that were known around the world. They had farming, fisheries, culture, all second to none. And their military was dreaded by the entire world. Yet, Isaiah made some very specific predictions about Tyre. I think, before I'm going to do that, I'm going to talk about this young lady here. She's older now. This is, down the corner here, this is a lady named Sarah Parkak. And she's an Egyptologist. And her goal in life, and she did accomplish a lot of this, it still is, was to show that these big sandy areas in Egypt that look like they're just desert were actually huge areas of city commerce and temples. In other words, we know where pyramids are now, but she says that's like a drop in the bucket compared to what's there. But it's really hard to find them. So she convinced whatever agency it was to take the kind of photos from outer space that go down into the ground and map out where this stuff is. And that's what she found. That's just one section of Egypt. It's all over that area. Egypt was monstrous at the time of the pharaohs and afterwards and before. All right? 3,000-year history. But now there's a few places where there's pyramids, there's a few places where there's monuments, and the rest of it's all desert. But what she's unpacked, and they started digging in a lot of these places, is that it was so much bigger than anybody ever realized. All right? These are the prophecies that were made about Egypt at that time. It said Egypt would be harassed with civil war conflicts. The Nile's life-giving properties would lessen. Egypt's celebrated canals would be putrid and unusable. The prolific vegetation that grew along its waterways would diminish. There would be a dramatic decline in Egypt's fisheries. Egypt's envied craftsmen and artisans. Artistry of its labor force would be lost, and Egypt's renowned military would be crushed. These were all predictions made by Isaiah back when Egypt was a major power. And not just that Egypt was a major power, Israel and Egypt at that time were friendly to each other. Israel didn't dislike Egypt. It wasn't as if they were like just being nasty. God's saying, you're going to tell us to Egypt. And Isaiah's going, yeah, but we like Egypt. Okay? Isaiah also said this, and God, will incite Egypt against Egypt. A man will fight against his brother, and a man against his neighbor, and city against city, kingdom against kingdom. In other words, sometimes more than one kingdom within the Egyptian area. There were sometimes two different kings. But even at that, throughout the entire Egypt history, the Egyptian people, even though they had little minor skirmishes once in a while, they got along. It was incredible the amount of goodwill they had towards each other throughout that entire period of time. A guy named Doradus, and we mentioned him here a couple of weeks ago, he said this: there was an anarchy in Egypt, and the people fell into broils and tumults and slaughtered one another. That wasn't what Egypt was known for, but he's testifying that what Isaiah said about them not getting along came to pass. Not just from Isaiah saying it, but here from an outside source that lived about that time. Essentially, this interval of strife weakened Egypt, which in turn aided the invaders that would come in and eventually control Egypt. The Greeks called Egypt the gift of the Nile. Why? Without the Nile River, Egypt would not have been what it was. Okay? It would have been just the dust that we see now. So why was it so prolific? Because they had built a series of canals from the Nile throughout the area to water the ground, and that's how they have all those plants on the banks, how they have all the agriculture that they had, and Egypt was at the time of the Roman Empire, it was considered the breadbasket of the world, because even at that time it produced so much wheat it could give wheat to everybody in the whole known world around the Mediterranean. But Isaiah told them this: the waters from the sea will dry up. The river will be parched and dry. The canals will emit stench. The streams of Egypt will thin out and dry up. The reeds and the rushes. Now, the reeds and the rushes were what they made a lot of, they made paper. So a lot of that stuff that they did that made them great with their artisans and stuff was also dependent on the Nile. The bulrushes by the Nile, by the edge of the Nile, and shall be sown fields by the Nile will become dry and driven away. So their crops would be gone. And the fishermen will grieve. They will cast their line and mourn, because there was nothing. Well, the fisheries basically are going to dwindle at that point. So what we have here is ancient Egypt was predicted that it was going to fall by the wayside. One historian wrote that the canals have been diminished and dried up. These are pictures of those canals today. Didn't it say that they would be choked? They would be clogged, and they would be like stench. And that's exactly what has happened to most of those canals nowadays. Joel, the prophet, in 800 BC prophesied that Egypt's military, which was the finest in the world at the time, the biggest, it would be crushed. And subsequently, because of these events, Assyria, Babylonia, the Greeks, and the Romans all had their shot at it, starting in about 670 BC and continued through about 200 BC, when Egypt was no longer a major superpower at that point. After having 2,000 years or 3,000 years. Okay, now we're not talking about a superpower like the United States that's been, a couple hundred years, or the Roman Empire, long time, 500 years, 3,000 years. And yet at its height, the Old Testament prophets are saying, you ain't going to be here anymore. And they're not. They used to make paper. This is what the Egyptians left in some of their hieroglyphs. And each one of these little scenes depicts another kind of trade that they were good at. None of those exist anymore. They're all gone. It's not just the pyramids. I think this one's one of the most amazing ones I've ever seen. This one up here, this temple. These big things right here, it's just all carved by artisans. They're amazing. And we don't even know how they're built. nowadays. And that's just the outside of the tombs. I don't know if you've ever looked and seen, but that's what the inside of those tombs look like now. The paint's still on the inside after 5,000 years. Seems impossible. Okay? By the end of the first dynasty, the Egyptians were producing the finest linen in the world, and yet they don't anymore. And so much so that even King Solomon bought his linen and his yarn from Egypt at the time. But Isaiah said, those who work in fine flax will despair. The weavers and fine linen will be in despair or ashamed or gone. Okay? This splendor isn't here anymore. And Ezekiel said it in 30, there will be no more native prince come out of the land of Egypt. What does that mean? It means that we can go back in Egyptian history now and look at their writings and tell that this king came first, this pharaoh came second, this pharaoh came third, this pharaoh came fourth. All the way up to 3,000 years, we can tell that. But after the demise, nobody in existence today knows whether they're related to any of those princes. Now, that's not true. In Israel, they knew from the time of Abraham all the way to the time of Jesus who was a descendant to get to Jesus. We're going to see a big difference when we talk about Edom next week, that not only don't we know who who's related to the Edomites now, we don't even know any of the Edomites' names because all of their names were wiped off the tombs. So God said specifically about Egypt, you're not going to know that you're a descendant of these, but you're going to know who these people are. You're not going to know you're a descendant. But about Edom, he was very specific in saying, you're not going to even know who these people were. So it's not like he's making a blanket on all of these, blanket statement. He's making specific statements about one and then another set of specific statements about the other that aren't the same. And they come true to the people that they're predicted about. These are other places in the Old Testament where there are prophecies about Egypt. They're all over the Old Testament. And finally, in Ezekiel chapter 29, it says, Egypt shall not anymore lift up above the nations. I will diminish them, and they shall rule no more over the nations. Egypt is a player in the Middle East. That is true. But they are not a player of any consequence on the world stage whatsoever. In fact, and I forget what year this was. It might have been 67. It might have been later than that. There was a big war where Egypt tried to take over Israel. Egypt's still bigger than Israel. Israel beat the pants off them. I mean, it's a famous modern war, right? So Egypt is not just not a superpower. They can't even beat Israel, which is tiny, right? So what do we have? We've got very specific prophecies about two different nations today that all came true over time. I see this as more evidence that the Bible's telling the truth. Right? But unfortunately, a lot of people misinterpret a lot of the Old Testament scriptures and try to put them as something that's going to talk about today. The Old Testament scriptures never talk about today. They either talk about the people at the time that God was having judgment against, or the prophecies are talking specifically about Jesus. Right? All Old Testament scriptures. That's all they're about. Nothing to do with us nowadays. You're not sure about that? Watch my Revelation class. Right? Any questions?